Welcome. We're so glad that some of you are here to join us today. We have some folks still coming in, so we're just going to take about another minute and then we will get started. We might have some folks joining us even once we get going. So welcome though. We're all glad you're here. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Trish Rocky. I'm an associate professor at the University of Denver, and I'm the chair of the health section for the American Psychological Association Division 17, which is sponsoring this webinar. I just wanted to share a little bit about the section before we jump in to our esteemed speaker. We're really grateful to have her here with us today. So the health section of Division 17, we are really focused on the science and practice of counseling psychology in health-related contexts. That could be through research, clinical practice, policy work, working directly with clinical populations or more indirectly. So really meant to be a section that's a home for counseling psychologists who are interested in health. And we have lots of opportunities for getting involved in our section. We have a board, and that always includes student reps as well as community members at large. And we also, within our board, we sponsor different activities such as this webinar today. And we're always wanting to hear from folks about what topics are of interest and of need, how the section can best support them. We also offer mentoring. So we're going to have a group mentoring section later in May that we encourage folks to join either as mentees or as mentors. And we recently have also started offering different awards to recognize counseling health psychologists in the field and kind of spread the word about the amazing work that they're doing. Amanda, our chair-elect, has put in the chat box some of the links to our section, so feel free to check those out. Feel free to contact me directly if you're interested in this section, but we're just really glad that you're here with us. Few little logistical reminders. If you can make sure that you're muted, and once we get going, if you're willing to mute or actually to turn off your camera, we know that sometimes pets and other things like to join our meetings, and so just for our presenters focus, it might be a little bit easier if we all have our videos off. And the chat box is open, so any comments, there's going to be some question prompts for self-reflection if you want to use the chat box for that. And we'll save the big questions though about the topic for the end of our presentation time. But welcome, so glad you're here. And next I'm going to introduce Dr. Amanda Mitchell, our chair-elect for the health section.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today, and I'm honored to introduce you to our speaker for the Division 17 Health Section webinar, Millicent Cahoon. Millicent's pronouns are she, her. Millicent is a second-year doctoral student at the University of Louisville in the Counseling Psychology program. Millicent's research interests focus on race, social status, and its implication on mental health outcomes. Millicent's current work has evolved toward recapturing Indigenous mental health interventions through relationship building and healing in a community context. Millicent is the founder and director of the nonprofit Therapists for Protester Wellness, or T4PW. T4PW was created during the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement and has worked with over 100 professionals, mental health professionals in particular, within multiple disciplines to cultivate a space of community healing for protesters and community members during and after the times of social justice actions. And we're so happy to have Millicent here today, and I will pass the floor over to her.
Thank you, Amanda. Everyone, yes, this is my amazing supervisor and advisor. So I just want to say thank you so much for that introduction. I'm super excited to be with everyone today. This is my first doctoral level webinar. This is my first one alone, and I'm extremely excited that it happens to be based on a reality that I've been a part of and continue to focus my work on. And I'm so happy to be here with you today and share with you all how we were able to start a social justice informed mental health organization that worked to meet the needs of protesters in the Louisville, Kentucky area. And while I apply academic and everyday application to this presentation, I encourage you to continue your own research from the amazing authors that I allude to and to seek immersive opportunities for activism work. You will hear me continuously use the phrase Black and Brown people today to describe the target population of this presentation. Black and Brown refers to those that have noticeably Black or brown skin. However, this group also includes people who identify as part of these communities, but have noticeably lighter skin, such as white Latinx people. So when talking about application to marginalized groups in general, you will hear me switch back to BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So we have to talk about people with inclusion of race due to the historical racialization in this country. And since we have always been categorized by our race, race has inevitably shaped our realities. So I also constantly refer to people healing versus coping, and is stated by French and her co-authors on her paper on the radical healing framework in 2020. The use of this mindset of healing versus coping encourages people to resist oppressive forces rather than learn to fit within and become passive. So overall, healing stands for being proactive when liberating yourself. Okay. In addition, it should be noted that we will hold all questions until the end, but I will have 2 discussion questions that you can respond to in that chat at that time. Thank you. And I'm so sorry too, I think my mouth's a little dry, so you'll also see me take some water breaks. So the objectives of today's webinar are to be able to describe therapists for protester wellness as an example of enacting community-based healing, develop an understanding of how your positionality plays a role within social justice work in your community, school, and workplace. And then I hope that you're explicitly able to name forms of activism that can be used within social justice work in your community, school, and workplace. So let me just start by telling everyone about who I am, my positionality. I come to you as a Black queer woman from Louisville, Kentucky. I am someone's partner, pet mom, daughter, eldest sister, and activist. And all these parts of my identity have shaped me into a person extremely passionate about the rights of others, especially those with whom I share a race, ethnicity, family of origin, and neighborhood. So for this reason, I have become very involved in the activism work my whole life, especially recently in the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020. The experience has shaped me in more ways than one. And today I will talk about the way I was able to weave activism into my professional and personal world. So let's take a second and look at these 4 photos. And I chose these 4 photos for a reason. I think they encompass the versatility of being an activist. So let's look at the top left photo. This was me in a very informal role, choosing to rescue a cat. I like to rescue cats because I feel strongly about caring for animals that have been abandoned. And below this photo, you will see here, I'm with the Kentucky governor. And this time I'm in a very professional role. So I was actually with a friend at a law firm benefit dinner for the governor. And while I was there, I made sure to ask questions about what he would do for the Black community. And I even asked if he has talked to a huge community leader who is the pastor of the largest African-American church in Louisville, Kentucky that I attend. And I was able to get answers in thorough ways that he was going to work for the community. And that was awesome to see. And that was a way of me advocating for Black folks in my local area. And it was really awesome because today the governor has definitely shown to be very, very promising. And the one to the right, this is during Pride with my mother and my sister. And this is going back to something a little bit more informal. This is something that I did in my own time that didn't have any type of professional need. This is just something that I truly believed in and that my family wanted to walk in. And of course, with many Pride events, a lot of the funding goes to LGBT resources. So again, me paying for that ticket, walking in that parade, and also walking with my mother's company was a way of me advocating and protecting LGBTQ rights. So lastly, up top, you'll see here, this is a photo more recent from the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020. And this one shows me in another light. This one is where I'm actually wearing the hat of being a mental health therapist in a grassroots situation. And I'm in the middle of talking to a group of people on why mental health was important and what work we were doing on the front lines during the movement that took place in Louisville, Kentucky. So from these examples and from this presentation, I really do hope that you all will be able to see just how important and versatile activism looks like. And even me doing many of these presentations on activism through Therapists for Protester Wellness has served as a form of activism. So social justice action is something that you can do in your workplace settings, but also at a school, and definitely something you can do in your community in many ways. So with that initial example, now I ask you, what are the forms of activism we see people take on today? You can answer by naming a person, an actual role, basically any example of how you've seen activism work be played out. So I'm just gonna give you all a chance to put some of those ideas in the chat. Social media, yes. Absolutely, mutual aid initiatives. Community organizing, yes, my favorite. Yes, ooh, speaking up at meetings to raise awareness, teaching, yes, yes, yes. Yes, donating dollars, absolutely, absolutely, especially to marginalized groups. Disrupting, also one of my favorite things. Pro bono services, advocating with the department and universities, unions. Whoo, yes, wealth distribution, reparations, things like that. Absolutely. Okay, yes, yes, yes. All of these are amazing ways that we see activism work be played out. And I'm happy that people were able to name things other than protests, because I love protests, but sometimes I think that people try to use that as an escape from continuing activism work by saying you don't feel comfortable with marching, you don't feel comfortable holding signs, which definitely could be true for some very valid reasons, but it could also be used as a narrow way of thinking that's all that you can do. Which then dismisses other ways to use your advocacy efforts. And that's why I want to highlight today just how vast social justice work is. It is protests, and protests are the biggest, strongest outward way to demand justice. But we also need ways to weave into our professional lives and things that we can do on our personal time to continue showing up for the Black and Brown people that we serve in our different health fields. Okay. So right here, I just want to start and just talk about some of the therapy approaches that we use today. There's definitely some truth to the effectiveness of traditional therapeutic approaches. And I believe that is the reason why we've held on to so many of our traditional methods and interventions for so long, as it has shown to be very effective. In other ways, however, it's shown to be very harmful. And we have to think about with whom these techniques, interventions, and frameworks were normed. And what I mean by that is that many of the mental health interventions that we do use have been shown effective for white people, specifically with the history of mental health. These theories were created by white men and administered on white men. And today, most therapy work is conducted by white women. And for that reason, as the field continues to emphasize how important it is to integrate approaches for everyone, but specifically for Black and Brown communities in their cultural consideration, we have to think of ways that we can modify what we already use. And there's two ways that we can do this. And the first one, I'm sure everyone's heard of in recent times, and that term is decolonization. And this is the removal or undoing of colonial elements. This looks like taking the client out of the therapy office, making treatment community accessible, taking away very structured interventions that aren't always validating to the Black and Brown experience. Decolonization is taking away things that we typically do in our field to attain treatment goals. And then next we have indigenizing, which is the addition or redoing of indigenous elements. And this is super important. This is about recapturing things that have already existed in this community. It's about including things that are culturally responsive. So these are the two ways that have to be considered and attempted when we are working with marginalized populations in any type of healthcare setting. So now I'm going to move forward and talk about an approach and framework that has worked to fulfill these two needs. One is not necessarily a traditional therapeutic approach, but it is an approach that is super popular for people to see in the healthcare and residential settings, as you can see on this screen. And then we'll talk about one that is rooted in counseling psychology. So let's first talk about trauma-informed care. And this one is seen most in mental health facilities and healthcare facilities. So if you ever worked in residential care, I'm sure that you've seen this one before. And what this chart displays is how important it is to look at a person from an intergenerational and societal trauma-informed way. So it's not about what is wrong with this individual, but more about what happened to this individual. So we also see the emphasis on pervasiveness of trauma. We understand that we are working with people with complex PTSD, especially those who are oppressed and exposed to triggering events every day. So there's a lot going on in this slide, but the most important thing that I want to take from this model is a lower square right here. I'll read it aloud. TIC involves vigilance in anticipating and avoiding institutional processes and individual practices that are likely to re-traumatize individuals who already have a trauma history. So this right here is the most important takeaway. This statement right here is the premise for any community work today. When we can get outside of the therapy room, we are given a unique chance to use existing tools to approach a person's concern. We bring our mental health training wherever we go, but we have an opportunity to modify it to a community's familiarity and needs, which is so important so that we can indeed avoid these institutional and individual processes that we can re-traumatize. So one approach I always hold on to when doing the culturally responsive work in the workplace is TIC, or trauma-informed care. So now let's turn to a new framework that I highly suggest we as a field should keep in mind when doing the community work. And this is called radical healing. So radical healing, which was curated by Black women in the field of counseling psychology, Dr. French and her colleagues, it's rooted in liberation psychology, ethnopolitical psychology, intersectionality, and Black psychology. And all of these frameworks consist of the similar notion that people hold the key to self-discovery. It encourages participation in social action from a group to create freedom for themselves. And overall, it declares that healing from racial oppression for BIPOC communities occur when a group works collectively towards liberation. So radical healing derives from these ideas and then adds in that it promotes that self-efficacy and collectivism amongst those who are oppressed. The framework comprises of, and you can see from this chart, strength and resistance, which is moving away from Eurocentric symptom reduction to multi-systemic forms of seeking justice. And then we have critical consciousness, which is acquiring knowledge that helps a group to facilitate their own healing. And then we have radical hope, which is having the courage and seeing a more equitable future to choose hope in times of oppression. And then we have cultural authenticity and self-knowledge, which is to connect Black and Brown clients and patients to their ancestral roots and ways of healing. So all of this takes place within a collectivistic setting where emotional and societal, social support are cultivated. So while you now have a sense of what each of these entail, I hope you're able to see how these tenets were demonstrated within the group I made as a mental health therapist during the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020. And then I hope you're able to see it as an organization filled with health practices that can be translated across your school, workplace, or community. So I keep referring back to this organization. So now it's time for me to introduce you to it while also connecting it back to the radical healing framework. So Therapists for Protester Wellness, or T4PW for short, is a group comprised of over 100 mental health professionals who have volunteered their helping abilities for the BLM movement of 2020. So the group now spans disciplines, including licensed mental health therapists, social workers, art therapists, music therapists, massage therapists, Reiki healers, and more. And together, this group offered mental health support to those involved in the fight against systemic racism and injustice and seeking spaces to process their internal experience while protesting. So as the protests have slowed down tremendously, the activism work continues to be needed. And today, T4PW has moved their activism work towards scholarship, connecting those with resources, and connecting the community members with long-term ongoing treatment. So how did we actually start and where did we come from? So for those who don't know, Louisville, Kentucky was the epicenter of the 2020 movement, specifically for Breonna Taylor, who was from Louisville, Kentucky. Breonna Taylor was 26 when she was killed in a botched raid by police in March of 2020. And sadly, her story did not go viral until a few months later. And since we were at the heart of injustice towards the fight for Black women's lives, Louisville, Kentucky became one of the leading cities that fought against police brutality and racial injustice. So T4PW was created at a pivotal moment of this movement On June 27th of 2020, protesters were downtown gathering like they've always done from the start. And the photographer by the name of Tyler Gerf was taking pictures of all the activism and action. And during this time, a shooter began to fire bullets in the crowd, and Tyler Gerf, the photographer, was shot. And this is what I call a pivotal moment in the movement, because this was one of the first times that people really were getting traumatized within this activism work. Someone actually died in front of multiple people, in front of adults and children. And it was at this moment that many people were running to social media, talking about not being okay, and people were severely triggered and scared after what happened. And there was this talk, but the activists did not want it to deter them from the fight, for this is the reason why we protest. So with that in mind, I had a friend contact me on social media, and she asked me, as a mental health therapist, what would I do? And after sitting on that thought, I sent out a message on Facebook and asked mental health professionals to come down to our meeting place if they wanted to use their mental health professional expertise for good. And then the next day at that Tyler Gerf vigil, we had 6 therapists arrive. And to the right, you'll see that picture. That was our very first day. We have yellow fleece that we literally cut on the ground, and we tied it around our arms, and we stood in the middle of the vigil area saying that we were open to consult others. And from that day, we started to see talk of the therapists begin to spread around the vigil, around the movement, and on social media. And then every day, more and more mental health professionals and advocates began reaching out to help. And as social action members continued to request our presence at events, we feel like it was time to have an official presence, so that people could see where we were and who we were. So that same friend who reached out to me was able to get a free banner from an ally that read "Therapists for Protester Wellness." And this is how we officially became a part of the local social action. So in doing our culturally responsive due diligence and along the lines of a trauma-informed care, we first had to take notice of what was happening to these individuals at this point in time. So we wanted to first recognize how difficult these 2 years have been around the world with COVID-19. It hit the US in March of 2020, and it caused mass hysteria. And not only did it cause that, but it also caused mass financial stress. People started to lose jobs, which then led to be unable to pay bills and rent. Catching the virus itself led to severe symptoms for some, resulting in high hospital bills, prolonged illness, and death of loved ones. And it left our country, and we know other countries around the world, with fear, depression, and anxiety, to name a few things. And at this point, we realized that our world was going to change significantly, and we definitely see those effects today. And then a few months later, we see a resurge in a worldwide BLM movement. The murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, just to name a few, went viral and reaffirmed just how unfair our social, but our justice system is. And specifically, we see how the murder of Black Americans came with no repercussions. And this ignited a fire of racial trauma that was burning in the community already, coupled with the consequences of COVID. So with all of this in mind, this helps us see the community members as a whole person with multiple experiences affecting their health. So as I stated on the slide about our origin, the movement relied heavily on gathering while protesting and while resting. This format was one that T4PW also followed. And the main purpose of Therapists for Protester Wellness was to exert that relationship building. We wanted to address the gaps that were in the communities of Black and Brown people that had been made due to the historical treatment of Black and Brown people. We knew that we had to approach a community that was harmed in a way that was most suitable and culturally responsive. So the main approach that was already being used in the movement and that we followed was called a collectivistic approach. And that was a way of people relying on one another to support them in addressing their mental health needs. And we did this versus an individualistic approach where we just focus on the person and their thoughts and behaviors. So with that, the community has promoted its own physical and emotional safety. And with this approach of collectivistic healing, the emphasis of relating to one another was used to reassure that during times of stress of the movement, us Black people, us Brown people, us BIPOC people already had the tools and love to resist oppression. So I also just want to bring your attention to these photos. The one on the left, this was actually taken at a praise and worship event on our waterfront lawn. And at this time, people gathered while listening to their favorite gospel songs and hearing from some of the community's religious and spiritual speakers. And at this time, we felt like it was most appropriate for us to stay in the back while people took in the event and waited as the speaker then made a comment about how we find solace in God and in our beliefs, but God is also putting people on this earth to help us. And that's why when we find areas of solace, we should also couple it with getting treatment from health professionals. So this was a way that we worked with community partners. And again, another way to bridge the mental health gap that we saw in the community. So after the speaker ended, we then went up and talked more about how we connected with this as Black therapists, and that we were also people who were part of similar backgrounds as the attendees of this event. So after we talked and mingled, we also connected with those after the event as well. And then to the right, we see another setup. And this is just a typical day for us. It's a little hard to see, but on our table, we had bubble sticks, and we always had that at our table for people to have something to do at these events. There'd be singing, gathering, food, dancing, and the bubbles were just a cute little thing that we had at our table where anyone could grab it and just blow. And the kids especially loved it. So this had nothing to do with therapy, but it was just a way to be part of the community in a way that wasn't so clinical. It's just being personable. So all in all, both are needed when building relationships in a community context. So the radical healing ethical guidelines, along with the tenets that I named earlier in the similar frameworks, say that we must merge with our community when there is a time of urgency by using a collaborative approach. This is what we did as a group. However, we recognize that as a multiracial group, that we had to do this in a culturally sensitive way. So this leads to my next point. I would like to point out again that this was a multiracial group who was working towards Black lives. The white people working with us were more than the average ally. Instead, they were co-conspirators. And as we know, an ally is someone who lines themselves publicly with the cause. This role does not have to be active, and it can be as simple as having a sign in a door that says, "We stand with you," as a sign of solidarity. However, we need allies to be even more active within these causes, as there is work to be done outside of performativity. So this is where co-conspiratorship comes from. Coined by Dr. Bettina Love, co-conspiratorship is when one is actively working every day to make choices against towards anti-racism work. For allies who do this work, they can put themselves on the line. They can, argue with public officials and police officers, but can still have their lives, still have the privileges that they have. So what we are looking for in modern and progressive activism work is for people to actually use their bodies and their privilege in active ways. So again, co-conspirators are actively making daily choices and taking steps to eliminate that racism. So with this, it is imperative to have ongoing processing meetings within our group so that the co-conspirators could continue to learn, check their white privilege, and deepen their understanding of how to approach Black and Brown people, especially ones who are in the midst of racial trauma. And I think this mission has helped our group receive really good feedback despite having white providers involved. And the main theme here was that everyone knew and understood their roles during social justice actions. And here I list the main things to remember. So for people of color who want to implement social justice action, they are the ones who are leading any social action that the organization chooses to implement. And they are the primary partnership representative with community leaders and organizers. And for co-conspirators who want to be involved, they have to refer to the teachings of BIPOC health professionals. They need to listen to the requests of the BIPOC community members. They need to collaborate with community leaders and organizers. And again, you want to be a co-conspirator versus an ally. And then using your identity privileges to disseminate those resources. And then again, and most importantly, follow the leadership of those BIPOC individuals. So, can we go back to that slide? Thank you. In T4PW, the Black women led every event. However, the co-conspirators would help us with organizing our materials, such as the directory, mental health first aid, and handing out snacks. And most importantly, and especially for grassroots work, co-conspirators also use their bodies as a source of protection when directly facing police. So they played the role of security, meaning they were the person that walked Black and brown people to their cars or even home sometimes after protests as a shield against any hate groups. So this means that they were in front of actions where police would get most agitated while working with protesters directly. But this has definitely evolved, and I would like to give you an example of how so. So this is a great example of how co-conspirators still have to continue learning. So during a protest, and it was at nighttime, and it was, of course, the police versus the protesters, and we saw that police were getting a little agitated with some of the protesters, and I shouldn't even say a little agitated, I would say very agitated. And then a white ally, not white ally, but a white co-conspirator tapped me on my shoulder and said, "Hey, Millicent, let's go up here and let's de-escalate this. Like, this is not going well at all." And I stopped right there and I told her, "I will not be going up there. I am most likely to be harmed in the situation. And again, I'm not safe at all." And so the co-conspirator took time to just sit back and take that in. She went up there, she de-escalated the situation, and like we thought, she was not harmed in any way. So after that situation, she came back up to me and she was like, "Wow, like that was something I really need to take in and understand for next time." So that to me is a great example of how co-conspirators should put their bodies on the line, and then there's always something to learn. You can never reach a competent part of this work. There is always a continuation of learning, especially as co-conspirators. But with that, both groups, communities of color and co-conspirators, still need to recognize themselves through an intersectional lens. There could still be a sense of power differential for BIPOC health professionals because within BIPOC communities, they have been disenfranchised. So there's many barriers for the community members to hold certain job titles and to have certain education attainment. So with that, I recognize possible classes biases I could even be harboring as a school educated Black woman in a BIPOC space. And I had to find a balance between professionalism while also giving a sense of familiarity to the people in which I share Black culture. From my personal experience, it felt as though the BIPOC representation of therapists was more helpful than hurtful, as it showed the availability of local therapists, as many community folks described to us how stressful it was to only have white therapists. So therefore, the power differential with BIPOC therapists was not as significant. But it's still definitely still important that BIPOC health professionals remain reflected hold on one second. However, with the BIPOC health professionals, you should remain reflexive in this work. So during this past year, we have been involved in all types of protests, including caravans, occupations, marches, gospel praise events, and many other forums within social justice spaces. And we still will look at this as an honor. As we know, activism space was allowing a professional group in their space. And we're just gonna hold this slide right here. So over time with our consistency and dependability, we have cultivated a relationship with our community. Our goal was to bridge the gap of mental health barriers with underserved communities. Our goal was to destigmatize mental health for the Black community. So while we had those white co-conspirators in our group, we did give the community a chance to see multiple Black mental health professionals in one setting at a time. And we believe that through this process, we were able to address hesitancy and fear of therapy treatment. And we were also able to give out treatment at discounted and free levels at the beginning of the movement. So I think overall, T4PW has been acknowledged as a vital piece of change in our community. So this slide promotes one of the tenets I talked about earlier, critical consciousness. And again, that is acquiring knowledge that helps a group to facilitate their own healing. The purpose of having critical consciousness is to give information and create a sort of resistance toolbox that can be used in the future when there is, and it definitely will be in the future, another oppressive disruption in the culture. So as mental health therapists, we came with mental health tips that could be put in a resistance toolbox. For example, we see to the left, this is a flyer that we had going around about what to do if you get arrested. And then to the right, you see that we had a mental health first aid. We had this both on the internet and also as paper that we gave out during the movement. And on here, we give people calming techniques. We give them the steps to take of if you do feel like it's time to see a mental health professional or medical doctor, and even tips of how to connect yourself with your mind and body, which is super important in this work because you have so much adrenaline and you are very active. So we wanted people to also understand what connecting your mind and body is too. Not shown here, we also had other resources just in case people were in crises, and even a list of social justice informed professionals with the Black therapist at the top. So as a group, we truly wanted to promote radical hope. Radical hope for the community is them creating change on their own. And this means that we've validated their experience of racial and oppressive trauma. We ultimately believe that they had the capacity to create a future that would be liberating. And when we were out there, it wasn't just about pathologizing everything that was going on and what they were going through, but focusing on their strengths. Us being present every day in itself shows that we believe in the goals of the movement. So when there is a time of social unrest, we started a routine of always having some representation from our group there. Just like in this picture, we had about 5 to 6 members present at events, and at occupations, we had a table with referrals, psychoeducational materials I talked about earlier, Kleenexes, and basic needs such as snacks, water, mask, and hand sanitizer. And we will have some people walking around while some remain at the table. And the people at the table would either help people get in contact with a therapist, answer any mental health questions, or just consult with anyone in distress. So the therapists who walk around will pass out that information that I showed you before and reach out to people that they see in distress but might not feel comfortable coming to our table. So over time, with only this format, we started to notice that people may be too involved in occupations and marches at that time to engage with us. However, that need for mental health support still remained afterwards. So with this, we also opened up other lines of communication. So we added a hotline and an email address so that they could be connected with volunteers who are readily available 24/7. And in 2022, the calls have slowed down, but many reach out for isolated crisis issues. But for the preservation of our mental health and energy saving, for many of the mental health therapists in our group, we now have a rotation of therapists on call who answer the phone only during work hours now. So we know that during times of protest, we will be more readily available again. So today we seem to be most useful when we partner with community events, connect community members with insurance or ongoing treatment, or guidance towards mental health resources. And yeah, we practice that accessibility through our different forms of communication. So as we slow down from the movement, I would say the protests of 2020, we finally had time to update, rebrand, and incorporate our organization. And I'm really excited about that finally happened. From this, we now have an updated mission with core values. So Therapists for Protester Wellness mission is to collectively decolonize mental health using a cultural proficiency framework and to remove mental health barriers for Black and Brown communities. And we do this by addressing systemic and cultural practices that have historically restricted financial assistance, psychoeducational resources, and direct services to marginalized groups. And then our core values, and in order to abide by the values stated in that mission, T4PW will commit to the following actions. So we have decolonization and indigenizing, which is the collaboration and accompaniment that adapts to the needs and wants expressed by the community. Then we have direct mental health aid, which is being actively present for protesters and activists during social actions by providing therapeutic support. And then we have amplifying Black and Brown voices, which is bringing awareness to Black and Brown leadership and their initiatives in our local community. And then we have destigmatization, which is providing mental health education through online and in-person psychoeducational resources. And then we have scholarship, which is assisting and covering costs of needed mental health services. And I just want to take a moment and talk about that because I'm really excited. We now have a rolling period where for each period, we wanted to award 3 applicants with 5 therapy sessions for free. We're really excited that that has started. We're working on our pilot right now and we'll see how it goes. But our ultimate goal is just to have a rolling period of giving people those free mental health services and eventually enrolling some people in insurance companies. So T4, oh, sorry, we can go back to that slide. Thank you. So T4PW was immediately implemented during a time of unrest. However, it has greatly aligned with culturally responsive approaches and framework tenets. So it has gone to inform the work I now do in academia with Black and Brown communities and marginalized people altogether. So just with this helpful approach to mental health initiatives and how it was done in the activist community, the same can be done for graduate students and healthcare professionals in healthcare and mental health settings. So one thing that makes our group unique is that we did not only set up practices in the community, but we built relationships with the community outside of the therapy room. Our goal was to never come in and tell people how to heal. We learned, listened, and respected the community's community's boundaries. We ate with the community, we joined in activities with them, we opened up with appropriate disclosure with them and gained the trust of local leaders who led them. And before we attended anything, we continued to check in with leaders and community about where we best fit or if this event they are holding is where they would like for us to be present. So this gave them the power of having licensed therapists in their space. And I think what made us different from other resource groups at this time of the movement is that we were using those mental health resources. So there were amazing groups on the front lines who were doing amazing, amazing advocacy work. But I think that we took it a step further by not just having a table of resources everywhere we go, but actually being a part of social justice occupations, by actually approaching people and talking to people. And most importantly, we were very intentional about making sure that while we can help calm people in the moment, we wanted to make sure that we were also connecting them to mental health services with social justice oriented professionals. So we were both a therapist and frontline activist. So let's connect it back with the tenets of radical healing. The way we showed collectivism was through therapists being present in the community. We used existing community practices to inspire healing. Community members were the experts of their healing journey. Community organizers were a source of leadership, and we garnered space for critical consciousness by providing those psychoeducational tools given through that mental health first aid and support groups that were held in the community. We demonstrated radical hope by actively engaging in social actions taking place during the movement, and we used strength-based methods when addressing mental health concerns. And then we encourage strength and resistance by providing those resources that could lead to ongoing therapy and aid for everyday needs. And then lastly, we encourage cultural authenticity and knowledge by empowering clients to interpret and create meaning from their mental health information provided that matches what's important in their cultural values. So overall, there is power in giving information and letting them make their own meaning to the information. Just how there is power in silence in the therapy room, there's power in allowing space for therapy work to be done, but for community members to have professionally use their resources and privileges to create space for them to do what they deem fit. So while traditional individual mental health treatment sees the value in a specific theory and goals to obtain treatment goals, collectivism within radical healing depends on the goals the community wants for themselves. The expert of the community and the needs are its people. We can tell them how we conceptualize mental health treatment, but the journey is theirs. We are empowerment, we are space holders, we are the safe place for growth through the radical healing framework. So in summary, and through T4PW, We were able to help the community to see mental health professionals as activists and healers at the same time. We opened accessibility to a local network of mental health professionals who value social justice. We created a social media presence to further increase communication. We integrated mental health within the community, and we upheld the notion that representation matters by having multiple Black therapists present in T4PW, which increased mental health seeking behaviors on the front lines. Okay, so Therapists for Protester Wellness has become a part of our lives in the community's lives. And as you see from these photos and comments that I've put together, it feels like our presence and our initiatives were well received on the community level and even beyond in other places around the country. So we hope that with this presentation that people actually do consider replicating such a program with culturally responsive recommendations, because from our eyes, we truly believe that this is the future of mental health. So I just want to look at some of the comments here. And the first one to the left, you see one of our members in our group was just checking in on us. So our relationship was very reciprocated. And then below that, and to the side of that photo, you see that we were even picked up from NBC News and TMZ. But while that's great, I do just hope that that allows people to see what we do around the country. And I really love the one just in the bottom. It was just a simple thank you for all that you do. That means a lot. And it just shows again that we really try to build a relationship with our community members. And then we see that we even have a comment by our state representative, Attica Scott, who was arrested with her daughter at one of the social justice actions, and she thanked us for our work. And then we were also featured in my school's magazine, and then recognized by other people too. So one big group that came down to our protest was Until Freedom, and the pastor that came really thought our table was so cool. So he was the one who actually took that picture at the bottom, greeting the Rev, because he thought it was just so cool of the work that we were doing. And then to the bottom right, you'll see a picture taken by the Say Her Name bike group. And it was a bike group that went to Breonna Taylor's home and around Louisville, Kentucky for social justice. And they again thanked us for being there while they rested at the end of their bike ride. So overall, I hope that you can see from these pictures that it seemed like we really did make a difference. So just like that, other health settings can also make sure to cultivate a space of treatment that allows for autonomy, rediscovery, self-efficacy, cultural sensitivity, and safety. It takes asking what they need while also being aware of your own identity and biases. So with this, we can make BIPOC communities get access to the health treatment they deserve. So today we learned a little bit more, or probably just brushed up on trauma-informed care. And then we learned about the radical healing framework. Then we were able to apply that to a real world example with Therapists for Protester Wellness, which pertained to the activism work of mental health professionals. So I know here today we have people from many different fields, health psychology disciplines, and many activists I invited to come in. So for some, this may be very new, and for others, this work can feel very salient. So with whatever discipline you're coming from, I ask you this today. What are groups and communities that you are already a part of? And what are you already doing? And how can you incorporate it in the work that you do now for the community? You can briefly answer that if you want to in the chat, but I just want you to take that away with you. Is it marching? Is it spreading information on social media? Is it having culturally responsive resources in your therapy or healthcare room? Does it look like speaking with community leaders to brainstorm ways to provide care in the actual community? With this information, you decide. So I want to thank everyone so much for coming to my webinar today. I feel so lucky and thankful that I continue to get spaces to talk about something that I created as a Black woman and something that I feel so passionate about. And I really do hope that you take something away from this today. And then I also want to thank Della Mosley, who is actually one of the founders of the Radical Healing Framework, for her input and acknowledgement of my work and how it connected to the Radical Healing Framework. She said, and I quote, that my work was fire. So I'm really happy to just get her feedback on this work. I'm very grateful. Yeah, so if you want to talk more and follow up, definitely take down my email, and please consider giving to our scholarship fund at our Venmo at T4PWLU, and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Therapists for Protester Wellness. That completes my presentation. Thank you so much. I guess now too, I can take a couple of questions for the last 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Millicent. I think that the description of this, your work is fire, is so accurate. I've allowed folks can unmute themselves, or if they want to send a message in the chat box. There are just comments currently in the chat about your work is amazing. Thank you for sharing it with us. Many, many thanks. Some fire little emojis, and comments about you're doing such fantastic work. Excellent and amazing work. Thank you for your inspiring work. Thank you so much for sharing this amazing work. You and your work are fire. Wonderful presentation. You're doing such needed work. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm proud of you.
Thank you, Mikey. That's my classmate. Thank you so much.
Others have commented, so grateful to be part of this necessary learning.
Thank you all so much. I really do appreciate it.
And there's a comment in here. I'm struck by the consistency and tirelessness of your work. For all the incredibly deserved moments of recognition and affirmation, there's a million more of just showing up and doing the work.
Absolutely.
Looks like there's a question of how do you balance your day job therapy work and doing additional therapy and activism without getting burnt out?
That's a really good question. I think during the movement of 2020, there's so much adrenaline. So I was just always on the go and felt like when the workday was done, I was ready to get out there. But one thing that we do in our group is that we practice grace. And so many people at a time in our group will say, hey, I'm checking out for 2 weeks. I'm going out of town, or I'm just going to focus on my family, and I just want to rest. And giving that grace to each other constantly has been very helpful. For instance, I just went to a conference and I had a lot of work due. So I told my group, for these 2 weeks, I'm going to space out a little bit from the group so I can focus on my work and this presentation that I have coming up. So I think taking those breaks are so necessary. And one thing about me, I'm going to go to town and I'm going to rest. So taking breaks is definitely necessary, and even taking those little breaks for myself every single day as well.
There was a comment about loving the framework for co-conspirators. Will definitely be using it in my work. Another definitely fire comment. I was wondering if you'll have access to the recording. Yes, so we will be, with Millicent's permission, she's speaking of Grace, she's been gracious enough to let us record this, and we will make it into a YouTube link. And so we will email it to all the folks who've registered for today, as well as try to get it up on the Division 17 website and the Health Section Facebook page as well. So it will be accessible to folks. There's another question about what was one or the many things you were most nervous about when starting this movement. Can you share what was grounding for you? I see and appreciate your labor, Millicent. Thank you for sharing. And yes to rest.
Yes, rest. I would say I was most nervous about getting arrested. That was a big thing in Louisville, Kentucky. Sometimes it was more than 100 or about 80 people getting arrested at one time. So that was one thing that was really, really hard, wanting to be a part of everything, but also being a little bit scared about compromising, my financial aid or something, because the police were very aggressive during the movement and were slapping felony charges on people for anything, just for scare tactics. So that part was really hard. So I think too, finding the group was really helpful to get people involved who were professionals and who, you know, they could have had their jobs compromised from being arrested. So that was one thing I was most nervous about, but I felt like T4PW helped me to remain active while also being less likely to get arrested, even though some therapists have been arrested. Grounding for me was definitely a lot of breath work, a lot of square breathing, breathing in, holding it, breathing out, and going home and just closing my eyes, laying down and doing body scans was very helpful, because I believe that all that energy, all that racial trauma that I was experiencing, it laid in my body. So doing that body scan work after a day of protest was very helpful for me.
Just checking the chat to see if anyone else has any other questions. But again, so thankful for you sharing your wisdom with us, sharing your time, and just your work as an inspiration and a fire. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone again for attending. And again, follow up by email if you have any more questions, and follow us on social media. We appreciate you all. Thank you, Jody.
I think that comment, thank you for being a light. It's a great way to close.
Great way to close. All right, thank you. Perfect timing. I also have a cat beside me.